Hello, welcome to Brian Cave Leighton Paisner and Landmark Chambers webinar, Could Zoning Work in the UK? We're delighted to see so many of you joining the session today, and we hope you find the presentations and the discussion to be useful and informative. My name is James Maurici QC, and I will chair the session today, joined by my colleagues David Elvin QC and Jenny Wigley, both barristers at Landmark Chambers, and by Giles Pink, partner at BCLP London, and Judith Gallent, land use partner, BCLP New York. And I'll formally introduce all of them in a moment. Two apologies. First apology for not being Lord Carnworth, who, as you will have seen, was due to chair this session. And secondly, an apology on behalf of Lord Carnworth, who couldn't make it today because of an unanticipated family commitment. Can I start with some housekeeping matters? First of all, your microphones will be automatically muted, so there's no need for you to adjust your local settings. Secondly, we very much welcome questions throughout the session, and you can submit these via text on the question and answer section, which you may find at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on how you've got it set up. And we'll endeavour at the end to answer as many of your questions as possible. This webinar will be recorded and links to the recording will be made available on Landmark Chambers website within 48 hours of the webinar concluding. Finally, on housekeeping, if your connection is lost at any point during the webinar, we would invite you to rejoin the meeting by clicking on the original link once more. So let us begin. As you'll know, the government plans the most fundamental shake-up of the planning system since the post-war period. That we know, but perhaps not more about the details, other than the government does seem intent on at least exploring the possibility of replacing our existing planning system with some sort of zoning system. And at bottom line, a zoning system involves, as I think many of you will know, designating a zone where developments in accordance with the code for that zone is effectively automatically approved. But as others have said, this sounds easy in practice, but may in fact give rise to quite a few practical difficulties and indeed legal challenges. There are real issues about how a system like this could deal with issues like heritage and habitats as they currently exist in our system. Indeed, it was said to me by Andrew Croft of Chris Blanford Associates, commenting on something I'd said about zoning, that zoning is always inherently attractive to those who have never used it. And we may have to ask Judy in due course what her views are on that subject. I think Andrew's point is that in zonal systems that he's encountered, for example, in the Middle East, they ranged from an anything goes in a zone type approach to a hyper detailed approach where only this particular form of development and nothing else is allowed. He described neither as particularly helpful. Again, we'll see later what Judy's view is on that. So could zoning really work here? Well, to answer that, we've got four speakers. I'll introduce them all at the beginning. And first of all, Giles Pink is a partner in planning and zoning at BCLP. He specialises in town and country planning law and related matters such as highways, CPO. He has expertise in the promotion of large retail, commercial and residential and mixed use schemes. He has a specific interest and expertise in large commercial development in central London, and he's worked on several very large infrastructure projects under the DCO and other regimes. Giles works for both public and private sector clients, and he works with the firm's Planning and Zoning UK group in its real estate department. Giles' expertise in planning-related matters has been recognised by Chambers. In the 2019 edition, he was recognised as a star associate. And Giles is going to give the first talk in a moment, after I've introduced the other speakers, to outline what the government zoning proposals are or might be. Secondly, Judith Gallent, partner in Planning and Zoning BCLP. Judy's the leader of the firm's US planning and zoning practice, counsels both private and public sector clients on all aspects of land use and development law in New York City. And following law school, Judy served as a law clerk to the Honourable John M. Walker Jr., first of the United States District Court, the Southern District of New York, and then on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. She has considerable experience of navigating development through a zonal system and dealing with the numerous agencies and their protocols that are necessary in such a system. In addition to developers, both large and small, Judy also represents public transportation agencies, schools, and not-for-profit institutions and municipalities. The bottom line is we're very privileged to have Judy speaking to us, because there's no better guide to the mind-boggling maze of land use and development law in New York City than Judy. We then have David Elvin QC. David's a barrister at Landmark Chambers. He practices in planning, environmental, public and property law, and has appeared in many of the leading cases. He's a general editor of the Planning Encyclopedia, a deputy judge of the High Court, Administrative and Planning Courts, a recorder in the Crown Court, having also served for 10 years as a Parliamentary Boundary Commissioner for England. David is a bencher of the Middle Temple and a member of the Bar of Northern Ireland. And David is going to speak to us today about what precedents there might already be within our planning system for zoning. And then finally, the final talk will be given by Jenny Wigley, also a barrister at Landmark Chambers. Jenny practices in the areas of planning, environment and local government law. She's appeared in many planning inquiries, judicial reviews and statutory challenges in the higher courts, including the recent Supreme Court case of Wright and Resilient Energy and the Forest of Dean. And most recently, she appeared for Airborough Neighbourhood Development Forum in their high-profile, successful High Court challenge to all the Greenbelt allocations in the Leeds site allocations plan. And Jenny will be considering some of the issues that would need to be thought about if one was transitioning from our current system to a zonal planning system. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Giles Pink.
First test passed, turning my microphone on. In order to look at whether zoning is appropriate and can it be implemented in the UK, we've got to first look at what are government's proposals for zoning. We don't know for certain yet. There have been numerous references in the press to the publication of a white paper on planning reform this month in July. We've got no reason to believe that that won't come forward at some point this month. Whether it comes forward in the form of a white paper or a more general explanation of what is to be achieved, we don't know. We'll have to see. I propose to structure this talk by looking at the objectives for reform and whether or not we can draw any inferences from what we have heard and what we have read in terms of what the government's proposals may look like. Next slide, please. It comes to something in current conditions where one of your short-term ambitions is to be able to say next slide, please, as per the daily briefings. Right, objectives. Looking at this from three different perspectives. Firstly, the perspective of developers. My developer clients often say to me, in the context of planning and the current system, they want to see a planning system that instills confidence in terms of the cost for promoting a scheme through the planning process and the planning gain commitment rolled up into that. They want to have more confidence in terms of the outcome of that process for the cost that is committed by them, and of course confidence as to the timescale in order to reach that outcome. And those are the three kind of central planks from a developer perspective that the planning reform needs to consider. From a political perspective, it's slightly different. The government's political objective pre-COVID was set out in the 2019 Conservative Election Manifesto, and this was in the context of a commitment to deliver at least 1 million new homes across this Parliament. In order to do that, they promised to make the planning system simpler. That's really the clue we have from the manifesto. They also said they wanted to deliver infrastructure up front, so presumably that was some sort of central funding of key infrastructure, rather than leaving it to developers to forward fund that. To deliver beautiful high quality homes, whatever beautiful high quality homes are, all the while protecting and enhancing the green belt. So those were the key election promises. More recently, Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State, has said the time has come to speed up and simplify this country's overly bureaucratic planning process. The government is thinking boldly and creatively about the planning system to make it fit for the future. So that hints at something a little more, something a little deeper and more pervasive. From the industry perspective, in April 2020, the RTPI issued a paper for reform. Its objectives and recommendations were focused on refining and improving the existing system, I think it's fair to say, with a greater emphasis on raising the status and planning and funding of the planning function within local authorities. Next slide, please. So where does zoning come in, given what we've just said? Well, in January 2020, the Policy Exchange think tank published a report entitled Rethinking the Planning System for the 21st Century. They've also more recently issued several supporting essays. I think it's fair to say that given the credibility and experience of the authors of both in terms of contributing to the report, but also the authors of the individual essays, they're well worth a read. If you haven't already done so, the report lays at the feet of the planning system, the current planning system, the ills of society, from high land values to failed housing delivery to social inequality. It's a wide-ranging critique. The recommendations in the report include ditching a local plan system, which is based on assessed need and land availability to meet that need and not much else, through a state rationing of development permits and state rationing of the release of land, in favour of a simpler binary approach of identifying through zones land that can either be built on or land that can't be built on or shouldn't be built on. In the case of the former, applying a locally imposed set of rules covering potentially design guidance and land use hierarchies, with local politicians setting the zones and the rules, and officers simply assessing scheme compliance with the rules. So you know, if you own land and you bring forward a scheme in a zone that complies with the rules, there should be no question over you obtaining your development consent. It's been well documented. A member of the think tank recently became a special advisor to 10 Downing Street, and there's also been a whisper going round that Dominic Cummings has planning reform in his sights too, and so I think the saying goes 2 + 2 equals whatever the Treasury may decide. But the point is, with all of this whispering and rumour, we can see that what is the clear link through from the Policy Exchange paper through and his recommendation for zoning through to the current reform proposals by government. If you're not convinced, the now familiar toe dip for new policy, i.e. in the press about a month or two before it's properly announced, came in the form of a Financial Times article on the 10th of June 2020. Could you change the slide, please? In the FT, it was reported that central to the proposals are the introduction of a zonal planning system and the creation of special development zones. One proposal is to change England's design code so that attractive buildings can be sped through the planning process. This would be using an as-a-rights system with zoning codes, of course, presenting some sort of with some sort of counterbalance in relation to heritage or habitats or other ecological factors. Ministers are also considering, it was reported, the creation of new development zones where government invests in public infrastructure to stimulate private development. So one can see the link there between the manifesto pledges. Next slide, please. So this points, I think, to a two-speed approach emerging. One is a class of revisions that are easy to implement with more immediate effects. For example, the expansion of permitted development rights or funding programs for specific sectors, as against a deeper, more substantial change to the system that will take longer to implement and bear fruit. This is where the discussion of zoning comes in. Next slide, please. In relation to the latter of those 2 points, there might be, in current circumstances, a potential limitation to such a deep-rooted reform. We bear in mind that we now have just over 3.5 years left of the current government term, where a difference has to be made to convince those who voted Conservative for the first time to vote for the Conservatives again. There are also the headwinds of Brexit and COVID-19 to combat. And so it may be politically unrealistic to expect the sort of purist reform that is proposed in the policy exchange paper. But the eagerness for reform does appear to remain strong. So while the substance may be becoming diluted, the rhetoric certainly is being maintained. Next slide, please. So what might this look like? Well, here with a degree of speculation, I attempt to pull all the strands together from both what I've read and what's been set out in the press. We might see not quite a simple binary zoning system, but certainly a simplified local plan process that designates zones with principal planning uses and development rules, compliance with which would fast-track applications, and also those local plans making special provision for heritage assets and social infrastructure, ecological designation, that sort of thing. I think given the purpose of the direction from which the policy exchange report came, and this turning on its head this idea of you can't develop your land unless you are permitted to, it's turning on its head to you can develop land you own in a way that you like, unless there is a particular reason why you can't. It might well be that the new system will free up land more generally to be the subject of development proposals, unless there is a particular reason not to. For example, conservation areas might have a different approach, or ecological zones or greenbelt might have a different approach. There might be a more focused approach to environmental assessment now that we've left the European Union, to hook back in and fit more easily with a new simplified local planning approach. And there may well become a simplified approach to planning gain and SIL to unhook the difficulty and delay sometimes caused around Section 106, and actually the payment of SIL levies, and actually seeing infrastructure investment as a result of that. With that, I hand over to Judith Gallent.
Thanks, Giles. New York City has been a pioneer in the development of urban planning in the United States. It enacted the country's first comprehensive zoning resolution in 1916 after technological advances facilitated the construction of a 530-foot tall building in a low-rise area of Lower Manhattan. And that building cast a 7-acre shadow over the neighborhood, causing a lot of strum and drang and a movement to institute something that would control what was seen as unregulated and out-of-control development. The 1916 resolution was a relatively simple document that established heightened setback controls based on the width of the adjacent street, and designated residential areas that excluded uses that were deemed to be incompatible. By the mid-century, though, the underlying planning principles of the 1916 resolution were discredited. Chief among its failings was that it failed to require open space. And if the city had been built out to the density that the 1916 resolution permitted, it could have accommodated over 55 million people, which is far beyond the city's realistic capacity. So in 1961, a new zoning resolution was adopted, which in very frequently amended form still exists today. It also started out as a fairly straightforward document that laid out use and bulk rules to permit most properties to be developed as of right, meaning without discretionary public review. While most development in New York City remains as of right today, over time, the zoning resolution has become more complex with the addition of certifications and discretionary special permits and authorizations to allow owners to achieve various objectives, including different uses, bulk adjustments, to achieve political objectives, and to respond to changing realities of the city. The zoning resolution divides the city into three broad basic use categories: residential, commercial, and manufacturing. In residential districts, residential uses are allowed, as well as complementary uses such as schools and hospitals and doctors' offices, but commercial use is not permitted in a residential district. In commercial districts, or most commercial districts, I should say, residential use is permitted, but then so are selected commercial districts depending on the type of commercial district allowed. For example, in some commercial districts in the central business district, automotive uses aren't allowed. They are commercial uses, but they're not allowed in that kind of a commercial district. And in manufacturing districts, commercial and manufacturing districts are allowed, but residential uses are not. And depending on the manufacturing district, the more noxious industrial uses may or may not be permitted. May I have the next slide? The three basic types of districts are further divided into a range of lower, medium, and higher density residential, commercial, and manufacturing districts to accommodate a variety of building forms and different permitted uses. You'll see here a portion of a zoning sectional map. It's a portion of one of 126 such maps that show the zoning designation of every property in New York City. Each has a use designation, an R, a C, or an M, which I think you can see on this excerpt, and a number following it. And the number following it indicates which bulk regulations apply and some other things, parking and other things. Some properties are also mapped within something called a special district, which is designed to achieve certain urban planning or design goals. You can see it on this map in gray with the abbreviation MID. MID stands for the Special Midtown District. The goal of this district is to create a central business district with the kinds of buildings and amenities that are necessary to maintain such a district. May I have the next slide? Each zoning district regulates permitted uses, which are classified in 18 use classifications or groups. The size of the building in relation to the size of the lot on which it's located, this is known as FAR, and I'll get to that in a moment. For residential uses, the number of dwelling units permitted is regulated, the amount of open space required on the zoning lot, and the maximum building lot coverage, the distance between the building and its front, side, and rear lot lines, and the amount of permitted and required parking. And there are a myriad of other controls. Next slide. So each zoning district has an assigned floor area ratio, or FAR. We don't say FAR, we say FAR. If you say FAR, everyone knows that you're not a New York City zoning lawyer. The FAR determines how much can be developed on a zoning lot. The FAR multiplied by the lot area yields the amount of zoning square footage that can be developed on a lot. So for example, here we see a 10,000 square foot lot with an FAR of 1. That means 10,000 square feet may be developed on the lot. It can be developed in a number of ways consistent with zoning, depending on what the rules are for that particular district. If that same 10,000 square foot lot had an FAR of 5, for example, 50,000 square feet of zoning floor area could be developed on the lot. Next slide. If there is excess floor area pertinent to a lot, it can be transferred, sold to another lot, but it can only be sold to a lot that is contiguous, an adjacent lot that's contiguous for a minimum of 10 linear feet. And that floor area that's transferred can only be used on the receiving lot consistent with the height and bulk regulations, height and setback regulations applicable to the receiving lot. This is a private transaction. It does not require any governmental approval. The zoning resolution does also allow the transfer of development rights further afield to non-contiguous lots in a broader geographic area in certain limited circumstances, very limited circumstances, to accomplish policy objectives. For example, this is allowed for lots that are underneath or adjacent to New York City's High Line, which is an elevated rail track that has been turned into a park. And because those lots adjacent and underneath can't use their development rights because they can't build up, they are allowed to transfer their rights further afield to a broader geographic area to try to monetize the value. It's also allowed in the Broadway Theater District to support live theater and to encourage and to preserve the historic theater buildings. Next slide. As the city has grown in complexity, so has the zoning resolution. Since 1961, regulations for special areas and special subjects have been added, including these 64 special purpose districts, which I mentioned earlier, to achieve specific planning and urban design objectives or unique characteristics of an area. Examples besides Midtown are Hudson Yards, which is a new area that's been developed on the far west side of Manhattan, Lower Manhattan. We have a special natural area district, et cetera. Contextual zoning has been added to preserve local character. This tries to match new building forms with existing building forms. Floor area bonuses have been instituted to encourage the production of public goods such as affordable housing, publicly accessible open space, and infrastructure improvements such as subway entrances and the like. There are special design requirements for the 578 miles of the city's waterfront. And there are special regulations now for flood hazard areas after Superstorm Sandy. But the city continues to adapt the zoning resolution to changing land use patterns and politics through hundreds of both privately and publicly sponsored amendments to the resolution. As a result of these amendments, the text of the zoning resolution, which was 268 pages when it was first adopted in 1961, is today 1,500 pages. And growing. Next slide. The vast majority of development in New York City is as of right, meaning that it fully complies with the zoning resolution. For that kind of development, a skilled architect, and it does take a skilled architect, assisted at times by a zoning consultant or a zoning lawyer if there is an issue of interpretation, and there often is, that architect prepares plans that comply with the applicable regulations. The plans are then filed at the New York City Department of Buildings, which is charged with reviewing the plans for compliance with the zoning resolution, as well as with New York City's construction codes. Prior to zoning approval, there is a 45-day challenge period during which the project zoning analysis is available on the Department of Buildings website, and the public can challenge it. DOB can either credit or accept the challenge and send the developer and architect back to the drawing board to fix the issue, or decline the challenge and stand by the analysis and issue a building permit. If a challenge is rejected initially, there are several layers of appeal at the Department of Buildings, and ultimately a challenger can go to court. But once the department is satisfied that the plans comply with all applicable regulations, it issues a building permit and construction can begin. No further zoning approval is required, but there are some parallel regulatory processes related to historic preservation and environmental laws that I'll get to in a moment. Next slide. Oh, sorry, go back. I jumped the gun. If a project does not comply fully with all applicable requirements of the zoning resolution, meaning it isn't as of right, there's some aspect of it that doesn't comply with zoning, the owner has to obtain a discretionary approval from either the New York City Planning Commission or the New York City Board of Standards and Appeals. So first, the Board of Appeals. Zoning regulations, when enacted, are intended to apply generally to large swaths of land. But where the application of the generally applicable rules to a particular property would be unduly restrictive, a variance may be available as a constitutional safety valve to avoid a claim of an unconstitutional taking of property. And that's a topic for an entire other webinar. A variance is available only where developing the site in accordance with zoning would make it impossible for the owner to earn a reasonable return, and only where the alleged practical difficulty relates to a unique physical condition inherent in the zoning lot, such as an irregular shape or very shallow depth to groundwater or bedrock. The BSA must also consider whether the variance, if granted, will damage the character of the neighboring area or be detrimental to the development of surrounding properties. Where these conditions aren't satisfied, and they often are not, but an owner wishes to develop something that is not in accordance with zoning, they can also instead apply for a number of other discretionary approvals, including a zoning map amendment to change the designation of the property. That's called a rezoning. That would permit different uses or different bulk, or a special permit or authorization to modify maybe just one or two regulations in order to accommodate a particular project. These types of discretionary approvals are granted by the New York City Planning Commission, which is a 13-member body with citywide jurisdictions. And as we'll see on the next slide, many of these approvals must undergo a review, a quite extensive review, and are ultimately adopted by the City Council, which is our legislative body. Applications for discretionary approvals are considered pursuant to a land use review process, which is comprehensive and time-consuming. It's called the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, but affectionately called ULURP. Through this process, any land use proposal that is subject to it is reviewed by all of the stakeholders in that area, including the local community board, of which there are 59 in New York City, the affected borough president, the city planning commission, and in some cases, the city council and the mayor. Proposals that undergo ULURP are also subject to a companion environmental review to determine whether the proposal will have significant adverse impacts on the environment, and if so, to identify mitigation measures. This environmental review considers impacts on categories including traffic, transit, air quality, noise, community character, and historic resources, among others. The charter, New York City Charter, mandates timeframes within which this process must take place. It's the process on the screen that you see starting after the green bar. Starting after the green bar is a 5 to 7 month process that begins only after the Department of City Planning decides that the application is complete and ready for public review. All told, this process can take anywhere from 1.5 years to 3 years. This is an abbreviated diagram of how it works. Next slide. As I mentioned, layered on top of zoning are historic preservation laws and environmental regulations, so that even if a project is as of right with respect to zoning, it may not be able to obtain a building permit without governmental review of a different nature. For example, in response to the demolition of, as you see on the screen, New York City's iconic Beaux-Arts Pennsylvania Station in 1963 to make way for Madison Square Garden, which is quite ugly, the New York City Planning Commission, New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, was created to protect the city's architecturally, historically, and culturally significant buildings and sites. LPC may designate as landmarks buildings that are at least 30 years old, which might seem funny to you as you have such a much longer history, as well as historic districts, and they regulate these buildings and districts after designation. Buildings can be exterior landmarks or even interior landmarks. There are today more than 36,000 landmark properties in New York City, most of which are located in 141 historic districts, but there are also 1,400 individually landmarked buildings of special significance. If a property falls within the Landmarks Commission's jurisdiction, a building permit cannot be issued until the Commission has issued an approval called a Certificate of Appropriateness. That standard is somewhat loose, as you might imagine, and there is no guarantee that an owner will be able to use all of its as-of-right floor area when it is to landmarks jurisdiction. Finally, development is also subject to a myriad of New York City and New York State and federal environmental laws regarding the handling of hazardous materials, energy requirements, wetlands, noise, habitat, etc. So now I will turn it over to David Elvin to talk about precedents that are closer to home.
Thanks, Judith. Next slide, please. The English and Welsh planning system, and particularly the English system, since the two have diverged slightly since devolution, has flirted with a number of modifications to the current development system. And I leave out of discussion today matters such as DCOs and permission in principle and the like, which are relatively new introductions. There are a series of powers which have, in a number of respects, been cut down quite a lot since they were originally introduced, which allows a greater degree of flexibility, which may allow the introduction of zoning type considerations, at least through the designation of areas and the grant of permission for classes of development within areas. And the question that you may wish to consider is whether the government actually needs to do anything radical, or whether it can simply deal with matters through current provisions. Generally, all of the powers are underused today, and indeed, although you'll see from the slides in a moment that I've set out the original scope of the powers, a lot of the powers have been cut down in their scope with regard to planning powers in recent years. For example, the planning provisions of enterprise zones and local development orders have been significantly modified. Local development orders, the power of the Secretary of State to intervene has been removed, and in enterprise zones, the planning powers have effectively gone altogether, although they were originally there. So the models are there, but they haven't generally been followed, at least in recent years. Next slide, please. Probably the most significant groups of orders are the development orders, special and local. Special development orders are significant because they remain within the control of the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State may, in contradistinction to the general permitted development order, make special orders for particular areas, and within those areas do more or less what is done within the GDPO, which is to grant planning permission for specified developments, classes of developments, and of course subject to them to greater or lesser restrictions as appears fit. It can also provide that the local planning authority may grant planning permission in accordance with the provisions of the order. So there are two potential ways of dealing with matters through a special development order: grant permission or grant generic permissions and leave the details to the authority to resolve, grant certain permissions and then leave certain other matters to the planning authority. There's quite a wide variety of powers in section 59, and you can see from 59.2 and 59.3 that there's quite a large scope for the Secretary of State to proceed. And amongst many exercises of the SDO powers is the well-known Cardiff Bay order, which allowed the redevelopment of Cardiff Bay as it now appears. Next page, please. There you see local development orders encouraged by the latest iteration of the NPPF. It gives powers to local planning authorities similarly to grant permission for specified development or development of a specified class in particular locations. It's very flexible. You could grant permission conditionally or unconditionally, so it's a local authority equivalent to a special development order in that respect. And various approvals can be required. Next slide, please. However, as you'll see, LDOs are excluded, though not for the Secretary of State with SDOs, for developments affected listed buildings. Schedule 1 EIA development, that is to say the main projects in Schedule 1, or if Schedule 2 development requires screening. Now, the powers that used to exist, which are in the second bullet point, allowing the Secretary of State or the National Assembly for Wales to direct the submission of LDOs, those were originally there. They've now been revoked, but there is still power in the part of both the Secretary of State and the National Assembly to revoke LDOs made by local authorities. And if, obviously, if an LDO is made, which is then revoked, the authority may have to pay compensation. So LDO isn't in its current form, although it might have been before amendment, it is not directly a method for use by the Secretary of State. That would have to be via SDO under current powers. Next slide, please. You then have, of course, neighbourhood development orders and their special category community right to build orders. We're all familiar with the neighbourhood planning provisions that were introduced in the Localism Act. They are limited in that they have to be triggered by a qualifying body. This doesn't apply to the community right to build, which I'll come on to briefly in a moment. And again, it has scope to grant permission conditionally or unconditionally, and it can authorise a number of matters, which I've set out at the foot of the slide. However, of course, it is limited to qualifying bodies, that is to say, locally designated bodies. Next slide, please. You can see the limitations there. It's for qualifying bodies only, and they can only cover their specific neighbourhood area. You can't combine in one development order two neighbourhood areas, or indeed more. And they can't deal with county matters, that is minerals and waste, Schedule 1 EIA development, or NSIPs. Nor can they grant permission where it's already been granted. Community rights to build orders provide something of a gap filler, but you have to be a community organisation as defined in Schedule 4C, and it could grant permission for specified development in a particular location. But again, this is a very local concept, and therefore its utility as a means to impose wider controls or wider freedom to grant permission is unlikely to be very useful to government at the moment. Next slide, please. Once upon a time, enterprise zones might have assisted. They originally allowed for the grant of planning and rating powers, and enterprise zones as originally designated, I think 30 were designated all in throughout the whole of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. And this results from a scheme requested by the Secretary of State, and it has to be submitted in the form or within the parameters specified by the Secretary of State. These days, it has been much reduced in scope. The planning powers have now gone. So the scope that I've set out, which was originally intended for enterprise zones, has now been much reduced. And if you look at where it is, where these stand at the moment, there's a House of Commons briefing paper produced earlier this year. Effectively, enterprise zones are a vehicle for the granting of financial benefits by the Treasury, but even there, those benefits are now time limited. Those enterprise zones which exist, the planning issues have now to be resolved. It is anticipated by government through LDOs, i.e. in collaboration with local authorities. So again, while the powers here might have allowed a wider scope for a zoning type approach or a broader, more efficient grant of permission than the application procedures in the main act, those powers have now been removed. Simplified planning zones, the next slide, please. Again, a possible approach, but within the scope of local planning authorities, and it's up to them rather than central government. So if you're looking for a top-down approach from central government to compel action on the part of local authorities, simplified planning zones might be useful, but you'd require further designation, legislation to allow the Secretary of State to direct them. Next slide, please. There are powers of the Secretary of State to intervene, but not completely, and you'll see the limitations on those powers in this slide. Finally, next slide, please. Under the New Towns Act, and those powers have been around for a long time, they replace, in the 1981 Act, the earlier post-war legislation for new towns, which was there to rebuild after the devastation of the Second World War. The Commission for the New Towns, which was responsible under the New Towns Act for dealing with designated new towns, was replaced in 1985 by English Partnerships and then by Homes England from 2008, who exercised the regeneration functions in that act. The designation of a new town doesn't actually have to be a new town. it can be an area within an existing town or other centre of population. So the Secretary of State could choose, for example, to expand the urban area in particular settlements and to either to establish a development corporation under the Act, and if necessary, to appoint a local authority to oversee development under the Act. The development corporation can be appointed by order. Next slide. Proposals are to be submitted to the Secretary of State. Under the old circulars, which have now gone, many of us will still remember with fondness Circular 18 of 84 and its predecessors. That was in the form of a master plan. And for a classic example was the Milton Keynes master plan. Permission could then be made by the Secretary. Permission could then be granted by the Secretary of State under a special development order in relation to the master plan. And again, you have the flexibility of the powers I referred to earlier under Section 59. And there are also requirements in relation to the securing of preservation of heritage interest or architectural matters. So pulling the matter together briefly, there are wide powers, at least in SDOs and under the New Towns Act, although they're tied into the SDO powers, which would give the Secretary of State considerable powers for simplifying the system in particular areas without necessarily rewriting the whole planning system. Whether or not that will meet the current appetite for radical reform, it's difficult to tell, but it's equally difficult to see what could be achieved by a national zoning system that couldn't be achieved given that you're going to have to appoint somebody or a body to do the zoning under a special development order. Thank you very much. I will now hand over to Jenny.
Thank you very much, David. As that slide says, I'm going to be talking about transitional issues. Next slide, please, Josh. So I posed the question, which I'm going to try and deal with throughout my my slot. Could a troubling transition dent or destroy the zoning utopia? And I'll come back to the term utopia in a moment. So obviously the extent of transitional issues depends on the degree of change that's proposed. If it's just a tinkering overlay or an extension of existing zoning tools that David discussed, then of course there'd be much less transition or no transition to think about. So it really goes back to what Giles was discussing as to how radical this zoning scheme is actually going to be. There's a clue in the sense that there was a government paper in March of this year produced by Robert Jenrick, the minister, entitled Planning for this Future, which suggested merely an increased use of existing zoning tools that are at our disposal, the types of things that David discussed, permissions in principle and DCOs also. And that would be rather than fundamental reform. But since then, and particularly the FT article that Giles mentioned, the mood music has most definitely changed, at least in the way it's being presented. And phrases such as radical rethink from first principles, fundamental shake-up, root and branch review and overhaul are certainly being touted around, suggesting that what is proposed is much more radical than simply encouraging or incentivizing what already exists. And that's highlighted also by one of the essays produced by the Policy Exchange think tank, which certainly appears to be favoured by number 10, by David Rudlin, which certainly frames or presents zoning as some kind of utopia. Next slide, please, Josh. So if the aim is for that type of utopian system, it would appear that a radical shake-up is envisaged, and that would effectively need to be, over time, a replacement rather than a tinkering with the current system. And that would presumably involve seeking to replace wholesale the current development plan regime and the system of development control. And that is uncharted territory in the sense that there are no real international examples or precedents for changing from such a comprehensive existing regime to zoning. It tends to be the case that where zoning has come in, like in New York, it came in as a zoning system from the outset. So there weren't all these tricky transitional issues to think about. And if it were a replacement of the current system, it would be more than the current zoning type tools that David was talking about, because those are generally purely permissive and additive to existing rights. Whereas if you had the more binary system that Giles mentioned, with a codified scheme of rules to dictate both what is and what is not permissible in each zone, then there'd certainly be the potential for that to override existing rights and existing permissions. And all that would need to be thought about. So next slide, please, Josh. So first of all, I just think for a moment about what sort of time period we'd need to be thinking about for the transition to take place. One way of looking at it is, of course, the modern development plans. You know, from the 2004 Act, we still, in certain areas, do not have modern development plans in place, and that's 16 years since the 2004 Act came in. And of course, a comprehensive zoning scheme with the types of gradation and rules and systems that Judy talked about is likely to be much more detailed, much more prescriptive, and presumably would take much longer to develop and to put into place if it were to be as radical as indicated by the mood music most recently. And if you're looking at a granular zoning scheme in the tenor of the New York system, then you're looking at allowing a development as of right once it comes into force. Then, of course, if you're still intending to comply with the environmental assessment regime that currently exists, that would require much more than an overall strategic environmental assessment, which is currently used for bringing in local plans and development plans. Instead, you'd need to have presumably environmental impact assessment and appropriate assessment from the habitat's point of view on a granular, almost site-by-site basis to bring in that zoning regime. And that, of course, would also take significant time and resource. Additionally, of course, there would need to be public engagement and consultation, and that would presumably need to be at the different levels of the zoning development in terms of how it's brought into place. So there may be certain zoning rules that are brought in by central government, other codes that are brought in by local authorities, and then at even more granular levels. So, for example, design codes being brought in perhaps by neighbourhood development forums and parish councils. And at each level, presumably, there would need to be public engagement and consultation. That would all take time. And because the outcome, which is envisaged, so the certainty and simplicity that would be brought in by zoning, would inevitably involve a much greater degree of prescription. And that would heighten the incentive to challenge the zoning regime once it's brought in, because it would be very prescriptive of rights and conflict with certain rights and aspirations. So that litigation prospect would presumably also lengthen the transition time. So considering all of those aspects, in my opinion, it seems that the length of transition to bring in a comprehensive zoning scheme would be measured more likely in decades than years. So that is the context against the kind of issues that I'm about to consider. So next slide, please, Josh. So first of all, then, how will a zoning code affect existing rights, and not just existing rights, but those looser entitlements arising from the planning regime on which investment decisions have been based? So, for example, the entitlements that developers consider they have from allocations, for example. There would be a choice in the zoning proposal whether to preserve existing planning permissions or provide compensation for deleting effectively those existing planning permissions. And of course, the purer the regime, the more likely you're going to want to delete planning permissions that conflict with the zoning code that you're bringing into place. There is some precedent for this in the UK English planning system. In the Town and Country Planning Act 1932, even before the 1947 regime came in, there was a type of zoning thought about at that stage known as town planning schemes, which was envisaged to be a type of zoning. And while that process was being brought in, there was an allowance for interim development orders, which were effectively the first type of planning permission granted by application. And that was brought in those zones while the zoning codes were worked up. And when that was all thrown out later in 1947, those interim development orders, so those planning permissions, were effectively carried forward. But prior to that, under the 1932 Act, if a interim development order ultimately conflicted with the town planning scheme that was being brought in, so the zonal code that was being brought in, there was then provision for compensation to delete effectively that permission that had been granted and to allow for a purer form of zoning. Although that all then became academic because it was effectively abolished before really it had any opportunity to get started. There is only, I think, about 4% of the country was covered by any town planning scheme before the whole thing was abolished. So apart from existing planning permissions, there's also, of course, permitted development rights granted under the Act and the order. And how would those be affected? Would there need to be an Article 4 type scheme of compensation notice to abolish those rights if they conflict with the zone? What about existing use rights, which are not necessarily always visible? They can be dormant. Should they be preserved by the zoning system, or would they be deleted and then compensated? And if you were going to be getting compensation, how would you prove your existing use right in order to be entitled to that compensation? Would you need an actual certificate of lawful use, or would the ability to evidence 10 years of previous use and no abandonment be carried forward, so you could still get your compensation when the zoning system came into place, even if you didn't have a certificate? All questions to be thought about. Next slide, please. And then the more looser entitlements. What about extant and emerging development plans, allocations in those plans and investment decisions that have been made on the basis of them? Would those be preserved? Would they be carried forward, or would there be a system of compensation for that sort of hope value? And of that complication is of course heightened by the fact that in different areas there's vastly different stages of development plans. Some have just been adopted, some have been in place many years, some are emerging. There's different level development plans with neighbourhood plans coming into place. How will all those be dealt with? When will the cut-off point be? Should they all continue to be progressed if a zoning system is pending? All questions that will need to be answered. And would there be a presumption that existing or emerging allocations will be carried through to the zoning system? Or is there no presumption at all? Is there heightened uncertainty about that? And is the faith in the development plan system then dented? What about existing sort of non-development zones like Greenbelt, AONB and national parks? Is the presumption, or would the presumption be that they would be zoned as no development? And what about the other sort of more tricky areas like heritage assets and their settings? They're of course not defined and they depend on the context of the proposed development. How would you go about prescribing what would happen there? What about areas beyond current settlement boundaries? Now, the zoning system envisaged in the David Rudlin essay clearly envisages the certainty and simplicity of having a no development zone and making that absolute, so an absolute ban on development in those types of areas. If that were brought in, would there be compensation for the loss of hope value in those areas? Because of course currently those areas, whilst they're restricted in development terms, there is always the possibility of meeting the tests of exceptional, very special circumstances, or the major development test in AONB and the like. There is always the possibility of still getting development permission or planning permission in those areas. If that was taken away entirely, would there be some compensation for loss of hope value? Next slide, please, Josh. And what would be the practical consequences of all that uncertainty? And remember, of course, that in my view, at least, that uncertainty may well last decades. Would it have a chilling effect on investment if the allocation or the permission is not certainly going to be going to stand after zoning? What about the effect on innovation of new land uses if there is the perception that zoning will effectively ossify the existing type of land uses at that time? What about the effect on the more sort of softer things like morale and motivation of planning officers? What's the point in working hard to get this local plan in place if it's only going to be in place for a year, or if it will never have any effect at all ultimately because it will be superseded? And if you have a system of compensation for existing rights, will there be certainty about how those rights can be demonstrated and what the cutoff will be? Or would the uncertainty mean that there would be a rush in applications for certificates of lawfulness, or a rush in applications for planning permissions in those hope value areas, in those greenbelt or countryside areas, in order to establish the rights for which compensation may be granted? And then, of course, if there is that rush of applications to be dealt with by development control, what effect would that have on the planning skills and resources available to forward planning to continue to process the development plans in the interim and to do the massive job of developing the zoning codes? There would presumably be a massive planning expertise resource gap unless considerable funding and resources were found. I've already mentioned the potential increase in litigation because of the inflexible outcome of zoning, which is needed to deliver the certainty of zoning. There's likely to be an increased incentive to litigate and to challenge the zoning schemes, and potentially higher litigation in terms of whether development fits in that scheme, because once evaluative judgment is removed from that decision, arguably it's more of a hard-edged legal test, which could again lead to an increase in litigation. And then, of course, if all these matters are thought about and dealt with properly, there may well be a need for new legislation and regulations, and that will have a knock-on effect on the pressure on parliamentary time. And next slide, please, Josh. And just as a sort of parallel point, of course, the Environment Bill is currently going through Parliament. How will zoning dovetail with that? How will the more environmental issues such as climate change, air quality, and I've already mentioned settings of heritage assets and those things, how will they be factored into the zoning schemes, or will they be dealt with separately? Is the what's behind government's proposals simply to be more permissive and to depart from the rigour of existing EU law in terms of things like habitats assessment and environmental assessment? And should we be thinking that that might come sooner rather than later when the transition period is over? Or if not the case, will it be the situation, as I think, as I understand it, perhaps is happening in New York and in Hong Kong, where those types of issues are simply hived off into another layer, into a parallel regime, such as the environmental permitting regime? And if that were the case, then the certainty that is dreamed about would perhaps be compromised largely, and there would effectively be a recreation of development control, at least to a certain extent, by another name. And next slide, please, Josh. So I'm quite aware that I'm being quite negative in all of this. So I did have to think about what the solutions might be to prevent transition destroying the utopia that's being dreamed about. Well, I mean, perhaps, and this has already been mentioned by other speakers, but particularly in the current situation, the COVID-19, the uncertainty of Brexit, perhaps it would be better to lower aspirations a little bit and abandon, for now at least, that radical overhaul, and instead encourage and incentivize the use of the existing mechanisms that are already in place and have already been dealt with in existing legislation. It does appear that they are very underused at the moment, and more use could be made of them to create some of that certainty. And allied to that would be to reconsider whether the supposed utopian certainty and simplicity, which everyone appears to think comes along with zoning, whether that might be entirely undermined by the uncertainty of a likely extended transition period, which I've talked about. But if the government's intent on the radical approach, then I think it's absolutely crucial that it also takes time to consider all the implications from the outset and designs a certain and transparent set of transitional arrangements so that everyone knows where they stand, and so that uncertainty is mitigated as far as possible. And that would or should help to avoid the scramble to protect existing rights and entitlements, and the pressure that would put on the planning departments whilst they're perhaps trying to deal with the new proposals. And alongside all of this, I think that there's no getting away from the fact that it will involve a lot of work for planners and possibly lawyers, and there will be a need to invest heavily in planning personnel and skills, and that might even, God forbid, lead to needing to bring people in from overseas to fill those gaps. But if sufficiently resourced and if sufficiently thought about, then there is some hope that the transitional problems could be mitigated. Next slide, please. I think that's me done. Thanks very much, and I'll now pass back to James for the Q&A session.
Thank you. If I could invite the other panelists to put their videos and mics on. We've had some questions in, and there are also some that I was going to ask. So I was going to ask them in the order in which the speakers spoke. So I was going to start, Giles, just by asking you this. This is probably just a question about speculation, really, but how much we've dealt with a huge number of the detailed issues today. It's been fascinating to listen to it all. And how likely is it that any of this detail will emerge in any white paper this month? I know we're talking about Project Speed or possibly Project Haste, I don't know, but do you think there's any realistic chance that we're going to get any kind of detail about what the government wants to do in the white paper this month?
I think in terms of detail, it depends whether we are looking at a utopian vision as Jenny outlined, or as the policy exchange essays and report advocated, or whether we have a more, one might say, graduated, pragmatic dilution of the system we already have. I think if it's the former, then there probably won't be much detail at all, because I think it'll be all big pictures and grand ideas. So whether it actually fulfills the brief of a white paper, I think will remain to be seen, because it just seems that it's such a, as we've demonstrated today, such a massive topic having to deal with transition. Will it go into sufficient detail? I find it difficult with everything else that needs to be grappled with right now, whether they'll be able to go into any sort of detail this month.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
Can we just jump in on that, James, for a second? Just injecting some support for Giles and a degree of scepticism. Let's bear in mind that huge planning reforms were promised in 2002, 2003 by a previous administration, and what we ended up with was the 2004 Act the fairly disastrous tinkering with local plans, which has caused the system to slow down. But you seem to start with grand ideas and then something rather less exciting and radical emerges. But who knows, with Mr. Cummings at the helm.
Thank you. I was going to turn to Judy. One question we've been asked, Judy, is how can zoning deal with things like placemaking, high quality design, master planning, beauty in development? How does a zoning system deal with those kind of things?
It's a good question. As of right, zoning does not regulate design, certainly not explicitly, but rather building envelopes. So there might be specifications for base heights and setbacks and articulation of various kinds in the facade of a building, but there's no review of design per se. In certain settings, design does come into play. For example, if your project has to go through ULURP, the land use review procedure, because it needs a discretionary approval, there is opportunity for feedback on the design. And while it may or may not be explicitly a part of the findings that the commission has to make to grant whatever permission you're looking for, it can be, design can be influenced because it's ultimately a process of pleasing others. And so you can get a message that the chair of the commission doesn't like your design and you will respond accordingly. There may be special permits where design is explicitly mentioned, or certainly the creation of a better site plan for a large lot. There are certain special permits for large lots that explicitly do mention that. Also in the context of lots subject to the Landmarks Preservation Commission, their design is really on the table, but it's design not so much as what the commissioners like, but what they view as appropriate to the historic context in which the development is located. So those are three instances. In other jurisdictions, not in New York, certainly in the New York City suburbs, there's something called a board of architectural review. And those bodies may get more into design, but that has not been a New York City thing. And there have been some criticism of the system for that reason. And in terms of placemaking, the tool of the special district is very effective in terms of placemaking. So, for instance, Hudson Yards is a neighborhood that didn't exist 20 years ago. It's the far west side. It was a rail yard that was platformed over to create New York's newest business district. And the zoning of that special district had a master plan in mind with a centralized park, and it facilitated that in various ways. So the special district tool allows customization and placemaking.
Thank you. And Judy, I don't know, has anyone else got anything to add on that question? No. Okay. Judy, can I ask you something else? Obviously, in our UK system, the role of locally elected politicians is hugely important, both in terms of local plans and also individual planning decisions. Where do elected local politicians, elected local officials fit into the zoning process in New York?
So in several places, actually. First, in the adoption of the zoning regulations themselves. You know, while the vast majority of the resolution was adopted in 1961, and I was not around then to know what that was like, every time the zoning resolution is amended, that amendment goes to our city council, which is our legislative body. So that's obviously a very large opportunity to influence the process and to set the rules that are then the as of right rules. So that's the first place. After the rules are adopted, local elected officials can encourage challenges during the challenge period. So if a particular project posts a zoning analysis and there's something about it that the local elected official thinks is an exploitation or manipulation that wasn't intended of the zoning resolution, they can either themselves or encourage their constituents to bring challenges, and their support is often effective. This happened recently with the super tall towers that are springing up around here. Those towers were as of right. but there were challenges to some of them, and ultimately a zoning amendment was adopted to prevent them. In the ULURP process itself, there is a formal role for government officials. Both the borough president, who's elected, gets to weigh in, and then all of the matters that go through ULURP can end up at the city council. Certain ones have to, like a rezoning, because we're changing the map. A text amendment isn't ULURP, but it's a lot like ULURP. Those go to the council. And then a special permit is not a required city council item, but the local council member in whose district a project is located can decide to, quote, call up the matter. And usually when they call it up, it's because they want to make changes or kill it. So they also have that opportunity. And then finally, elected officials can be very effective at lobbying the Department of City Planning to institute changes in the zoning resolutions.
Okay. Thank you. We've had a few other questions in for you, Judy. Just I hope you can help with these ones. Does zoning apply in other US cities, and does it apply outside of US cities? And was New York an easy win on zoning because of the grid format of development? I don't know whether those questions that you can...
Yeah, zoning does apply in other US cities, but they are locally enacted, or so New York City zoning itself doesn't apply anywhere else. It doesn't even apply in the New York City suburbs, which have their own zoning codes. So every jurisdiction has to enact its own zoning. It's not a federal system in any way. Our New York City zoning resolution the authority for it is granted from the state of New York, which authorizes localities to use the police power to regulate the health, safety, and welfare of the people. And that's where the enabling legislation comes from. There are other cities in New York in the US that have made other decisions. Houston is a well-known example of what we call the Wild West, where there is no zoning. That may not be true anymore, but it certainly was true last time I looked into it. So every city is different, and zoning lawyers become specialists in their one jurisdiction, maybe in some nearby jurisdictions, sort of bedroom communities, but they're all different. Okay. That was one question. You had some others in there.
Yeah, I think the other one was, does it apply outside of cities zoning?
Yes. So as I mentioned, the suburbs surrounding New York, I'm most familiar with. I used to represent the planning and zoning boards of the town of Mamaroneck, which is a bedroom community of New York City, just a short railroad train trip, and where a lot of people who work in the city live. And they have their own zoning code and they implement it. So yes, it does.
And I think the other question was New York particularly suitable and an easy win for zoning because of the grid format of development within the city that already existed?
Yeah, well, I think that probably made it easier back in 1916 when the idea was first developed. But it certainly was a big undertaking in 1961 when it was massively changed. It took about 11 years to come up with what became the 1961 zoning resolution. There was a large report done in 1950 suggesting very significant changes, and there was a second, and that was well received. And then in 1958, a second report, and really that 1950 report became what was in there became the basis for the 61 resolution. But again, yeah, the regularity and the grid system does make it easy because zoning district boundaries are drawn along those regular lines.
Thank you. And then one other question we've had in for you is in our system, through private law, we have a system of, well, we recognise rights to light. So you can actually, as a adjoining property owner, because of the period of time in which you've enjoyed light, you can have a right to light, which can block development, even if you've potentially got planning permission for it. But where do rights to light exist? Where do they fit in? Do they exist? And is there any protection given to people's rights to light if someone puts a huge tower up in a zone as of right?
Right. No, here we do not have rights to light, and that is the major difference. If you want to protect your light and air, you have to get an easement. You have to negotiate an easement from another landowner. Now, that said, the zoning resolution does have certain protections. There are regulations regarding the distance between buildings on the same zoning lot, and there are regulations for front, side, and rear yards to create some open space. There's a concept in New York City where the blocks are rectangular of the donut, the green donut in the center of the block, which is formed by the rear yards of all the buildings on the block. And that donut has been considered fairly sacred in terms of people who want to come and build in the donut, because that does give people light and air. But you have no common law right to light and air in New York City.
Thank you very much. David, could I turn to you and ask you, obviously you've outlined a number of precedents for development rights or development powers, which have some analogy to zoning. Could we not make greater use of those rather than changing the entire system?
Well, yes. I mean, the special development order procedure, as I emphasised in particular, can be used to simplify the rules, and it can also be used to simplify the situation in areas where there's specific forms of development, for example, housing, which are seen as a priority, because you can grant effectively permission and then leave details to be worked out by the authority, or you can set the ground rules for the subsequent consents as you do in the general permitted development order. And indeed, if I can just wrap up into that, something that the Chancellor announced last week, which is the designation of a whole series of free ports, which appears to be perhaps a sort of early win type approach to planning. And this is all to do with financial breaks as well. But free port designation, which will bring financial benefits and duty reductions and the like, is also to bring with it apparently reduced simplified planning regulations. I mean, it does look like reinventing the wheel of enterprise zones, frankly, under a different badge. So one does seriously wonder whether it isn't better to utilise existing models rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater and causing the sort of chaos that Jenny was indicating in her pessimistic analysis as to what might happen if you have a brand new system trying to get along transitioning out of the existing system.
Thank you. And I think there's a question asked, is the perceived failure of the planning system directed to development plans, which are too slow and unresponsive? Is the answer there perhaps removing the development plan in favour of something like what you've been discussing, simplified planning zones, etc.?
Well, as I said earlier, when I added to Giles' point about previous announcements, what we ended up with in 2004, well, we had ultimately the abolition of the regional spatial strategies, and that sort of structural approach has caused a slowdown in local plans, because of course you have to reinvent the wheel for each local plan in terms of need. But secondly, you've created a system which, whilst superficially it looked simpler, i.e. you removed the modification stage to the local plan and made the inspector's report decisive as to what needed to be done. However, all the apparatus that now goes around it, the duty to cooperate, the strictness of the soundness test and everything else, all adds to the burden and the delay. And we've all seen ample examples in recent plan examinations in the last couple of years, authorities which are being tripped up by the difficulties of meeting the rules. So you can't but help believe that a lot would be gained by simplifying the plan process to something pre-2004, and also possibly actually providing greater funds for local authorities to be able to process applications by having more experienced officials rather than expecting them to reinvent the wheel and retrain its officers in new systems, which is bound to cause log jams in the system as it is.
Thank you. And then, Jenny, a couple of things for you. I think one person has asked, how would the complexity of the transition from our current system to a zonal system compare to some of the complexities we had with our transition from using Section 106 agreements to CIL? I think I know what the answer is to that one, but what's your view?
Well, I mean, that's a microcosm, isn't it, of the complexities would be, because that only covers one small area of the planning system, namely how you implement planning gain. I mean, in a sense, it would it shows what happens when you have two parallel systems and the complexity that gives rise to when you have an intention to simplify simplify a system by bringing in effectively a formula and an automatic levy, but then you don't do that wholesale, and then you end up with having two parallel systems. So you have the complexity of negotiating a Section 106 agreement alongside CIL payments. And then you have the distortionary effect there as well of trying to incentivize bringing in CIL by things like the restriction on pooling of Section 106 contributions, which had its own distortionary effects and complexities and litigation around that. So it's an interesting. I think it's only a microcosm though of the kind of wider and deeper effects of wholesale, of replacing the planning system wholesale by a zoning system, if that was what was to be intended.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, because you touched on this in your paper, and obviously I think it was also one of the grounds on which you succeeded in the Airborough case was SEA, and a lot of plans have stumbled at SEA stage. But I think if you had zoning, I mean, potentially on our current system, the zoning is the project level approval. So you'd be doing EIA, which obviously is an even greater degree. I mean, do you think that's going to cause even more problems?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought you might say that.
Yeah, I mean, as I touched on in the slides, yes, I think unless you're going to abandon the environmental protections that are in place at the moment, particularly the environmental assessment regime, then if that's going to be meaningful and as a result of zoning, you're going to allow development as of right, then unless you're going to hive off all potential areas and all potential developments that could have an environmental effect, then you are going to have to do some kind of more granular assessment when you're setting up the zoning areas and the zoning codes. You either do that or you have a separate environmental permitting regime, which then takes away the simplicity and the as of right being able to develop. So yeah, I mean, definitely that's a problem, I think. I don't think you'll be able to just have strategic environmental assessment to plug that gap. Sorry, Judy.
In New York, now I just wanted to add that in New York, when the map is changed, when the zoning map is changed so that, the district is what brings with it all the rules that apply. When that is done, there is an environmental review, an extensive environmental review, where the city will look at, or the private applicant, depending on who it is, all of the implications from an environmental perspective of that change in zoning. But once the zoning is adopted, any development that is as of right under that new zoning is allowed without that environmental review because it's been done. There are certain things that sort of survive the rezoning in terms of environmental, which is if the City Planning Commission determines that particular parcels of land within a rezoning have particular environmental issues, they can put something on the land called an E designation, an environmental designation, and that would specify that they have to either have a smokestack that's this far away from this boundary, or they have to do some sort of hazardous materials review. So there is a way to set those into motion during the legislative process that then survives the process and is incorporated into the as of right development later on.
But Judy, can I ask you this? If there's a failure in the EIA process, i.e. it doesn't, in fact, consider all the environmental implications of what's going to be allowed as of right in the zone, presumably you can challenge the zoning or the rezoning within a certain period of time in the courts. But if you don't do that, then presumably the fact that you failed to consider the environmental effects doesn't matter anymore because you've got a zone that's been zoned for that activity and it's too late to challenge it.
That's right. That's right. It's either challenged and fixed or it isn't.
Okay. That's brilliant. Thank you. Can we ask you something else? I've had a question in about what happens in a zonal system with development that crosses between two jurisdictions. So, I mean, I guess one example would be a new bridge that goes from Manhattan to one of the boroughs. You'd have the two bridges at either end would be being dealt with presumably by different zonal systems. And I guess there must be other examples elsewhere in the States. How does that work?
So the 5 boroughs constitute the one city. And so the zoning system is citywide. So it is true that if you have a bridge that starts in Queens and ends in Manhattan, you're going to be dealing with a different, say, community board if it's a discretionary review. So that complicates things a little bit. But the zoning system applies equally. You might start in a commercial zone and end up in a residential zone, but you would have to just comply with the rules for both zones, both at the starting point and the landing point. And that would be for a private. I actually had a project recently where there was consideration of building a private bridge, so we had to think about that exact question. There is also, the state also has some, and the city have zoning override powers that can be exercised. So there might be a possibility for just sweeping away zoning to get projects done. Okay. And then in terms of, that's within the city. If there were a project that, there really haven't been other projects, at least involving New York City, where it goes extraterritorially outside the city itself. I had a project once that went from one, that incorporated 2 small towns, and there was an issue because the little town couldn't control what happened in the other town, and the property straddled it, and we worked it out.
Okay, thank you. And then I think there was one other question. I think it's probably for Giles. Someone's asked, well, with the local government white paper due this autumn, is this a good time to transform the planning system? Giles, any view on that?
I'm going to hide behind similar answers given previously, which is it really does rather depend on what the nature of the transformation to the planning system is. I think the general tenor from this presentation is quite clearly, or to my mind, that we must be careful about the perceived utopia of completely changing the system, both in terms of how the transitional issues and how long it will take in any context, in any time frame, whether or not the local government white paper comes along or not.
Thank you. I think probably that's time to bring us to a close. So I wanted to say thank you to all 4 of you for your excellent presentations. Some fascinating issues lie ahead of us, and I think what we have established is that if anyone's thinking this is a panacea to all of our problems, then they probably do need to think again. So thank you very much to all of our speakers for their excellent presentations, and thank you all of you who joined us today. I hope that you found it useful, and thank you very much.